Thank you very much, thank you. And it's really good to be here. I think I came to ECI about something like 3-4 years ago, or maybe it was even longer, you can never quite remember, but it's very good to come back. And thank you for the invitation to come and do this seminar. Many of you, I think, will know a bit about Friends of the Earth, the organisation I work for. We're one of the leading environmental campaigning organisations in the UK. But you might not realise that we're actually the world's largest grassroots environmental network. So we have autonomous sort of sister groups in now around 80 countries around the world. And the thing that sets us apart from other organisations is that we're grassroots based. So in this country we have around 200 community groups that are campaigning at a local level to take action on climate change and a whole range of sustainability issues. Oxford Friends of the Earth, for example, is a good group, and I'm staying here a couple of nights in Oxford. We managed to double back the two events up, so I'm giving a speech and a discussion with Jonathan Porritt, who was one of my predecessors several times over back in the 1980s. We're doing a public meeting tomorrow night as well. So if you want to come to that, where we're talking about cities and climate change, do Google Oxford Friends of the Earth and cities and climate change in the event tomorrow night. So it's very good to be in Oxford for a couple of days. I should also say a little bit about me, and I don't normally go into this in too much detail, but I think for this topic it's kind of worth you knowing that I've sort of had two careers in my life, one as an environmental campaigner at Friends of the Earth and another organisation, but actually I've also worked at universities, which is perhaps why I have a particular interest in this topic. So I write for The Guardian and for Business Green occasionally. I'm almost embarrassed to see that now because I owe both of them articles at the moment, but anyway, we'll get round to that. I advise a number of companies on corporate sustainability issues, Kingfisher, the global retailer that owns B&Q and Screwfix amongst others, and also Anglian Water. But I worked for almost 4 years as Deputy Director of the University of Cambridge, if I can use that term here, Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And I've also lectured on executive education courses at universities like Duke and Judge Business School and others for several years. And as of this week, I was actually made an honorary professor at Manchester Business School, which is quite fun, and you're the first people I've told, so that's quite fun. Which obviously means I have a real interest in how universities are performing on these issues, and I'm also aware of the frustrations that many staff in universities, let alone students, have around this. So given I'm now in this curious position as Chief Exec at Friends of the Earth, it's quite fun to try and cause trouble around this issue. So the question we're going to be looking at and answering tonight is, are British universities doing nearly enough to help tackle climate change? And I've got some headings that I'm going to go through to try and answer this question. The first is a proper, university things. I should give you the definition of what I mean by nearly enough, that really scientific term. Then we'll look at different categories of university performance. So research, beyond research, finance and investment, a whole topic I want to discuss about the fossilised elephants in the room, and then finish up about just starting to explore what might be a comprehensive climate change strategy for any university. I want to stress, in the time I've got, I'm giving absolute top headlines really, because there's an awful lot to get through. So there will be so many more things that I won't mention than I will mention. So we need to just be clear about that. So the first topic, what do we mean? What does Friends of the Earth mean by nearly enough? It's a curious one, isn't it, on climate change? When you've had world leaders say this is the greatest threat we face in the 21st century, actually that's pretty a high bar then for universities to respond to. But we also know that governments aren't clearly doing nearly enough to tackle climate change as well. So how do we position, what is an appropriate response for universities? Well, the Paris Climate Agreement that happened less than a year ago, in December last year, I think at the very least gives the lowest bar against which we can judge what universities should do. I'm not saying you can go further, all universities perhaps should go further, but at the very least, Paris, given that it was agreed by 190 countries, Paris gives some kind of indication as to how institutions around the world, companies, universities, let alone national governments, should respond to climate change. And so, digging into that a little bit further, I'm sure you'll all be aware that Paris established the aim of holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now you'll see I've highlighted the words pursue efforts there. And I think this is really, really important, because in the sort of debate that's unfurled since Paris, this reference to 1.5 degrees, to my mind, has often, already there's been attempts to water it down. Already there's attempts to try and suggest that somehow this was less of an ambition. In fact, even just 2 days after the signing of the Paris Agreement, Amber Rudd, our now delightful Home Secretary, but then our delightful Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, talked about 1.5 degrees as an aspirational target. Now, to my mind, pursue efforts is not the same as aspirational. I'll give you an example. I'm starting to aspire about what I want for Christmas. Okay? I'm not going about pursuing efforts for what I want to do for Christmas. If I was, at the very least, I'd be writing letters to Father Christmas to ask for what I want. My children, in contrast, are doing more than inspiring what they want for Christmas. They are pursuing efforts. They are writing letters to Father Christmas already, even though we've not suggested that they do so. They are leaving the Argos catalogue open on the table on certain pages and starting to talk to me and my wife about various things that they would like for Christmas, even though we've not invited them to do so. So my kids are taking action. They are pursuing efforts about what they want for Christmas. Aspiring is really just, I think, in the English language, is hoping for. That's not what Paris said. Paris said we need to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above in pre-industrial levels. When anyone tells you that 1.5 is an aspirational target, they are wrong, and I'd encourage you to argue back at them. And there's a big difference between the 2 degree target and the 1.5 degree target. Very complicated graph, I know, and it's a bit fuzzy, sorry for that. But this was the carbon budget accounting tool produced by GCI in October, just before the Paris budget. And what you can see here on this line, these are different intergovernmental panel scenarios, intergovernmental panel on climate change scenarios, carbon budgets. So this one here, a 50% chance of 2 degrees C, settling at 2 degrees C, the upper one there. If you get down here to the ones that offer, and this is the other thing about chance, but I just want to sort of take a sidebar there. A lot of people around climate change, I'm sure you would, but you know, in the public media debate, the whole point that there's probability associated with these temperature targets gets completely forgotten. You know, that this is what we're talking about here is a 50% chance of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. 50% chance is not good. You know, in the cab that I had to get from the station just now, because I missed the first train and I had to get here in a rush, I wouldn't have gotten that cab if there was a 50% chance it was going to crash, and only a 50% chance of it getting here to the Institute here tonight. 50% is not good. You know, surely we should be trying to aim for better than 50%. So anyway, we moved from 50% chance of 2 degrees to just trying to get to 50% chance of 1.5 degrees. It's a huge difference. You can see this line coming down here. In fact, what you see here is to really reach 1.5 degrees, it's a very, very different curve that's needed. What I think is interesting about that is it results in a very different mitigation pathway for society. You can have a kind of intellectual, theoretical debate about whether shale gas exploration in Britain through the 2020s might be part of some kind of emissions pathway to 2 degrees or not. I don't even think it's that, for what it's worth, because I think political reality is if you start building a whole new industry, they won't shut down quietly when they're halfway through the investment of their plant. But that aside, you can have a technical, theoretical argument about that. You can't have much of a theoretical argument about the role of shale gas or an extra runway at Heathrow or any of these things if you're really aiming for 1.5 degrees C, let alone if you try and aim for better than 50% chance of 1.5 degree. But also Paris set out, in addition to those temperature targets, set out that each party's successive nationally determined contributions, so what each country is trying to offer up as part of the Paris process, will represent a progression beyond the party's current nationally determined contribution. In other words, all countries need to do better than they set out in Paris last year. Because we all know that it wasn't good enough. You know, what was put on the table by countries in Paris last year, as you know, added up to somewhere between 2.7 to perhaps up to 4 degrees of warming, depending on the models you look at. So it's not enough, so we know we've got to raise ambition. So Paris set out, this signed by all 190 countries, of course, including the UK, that parties would bring forward new plans that reflect their highest possible ambition. And I'll just let you ponder whether building a new runway at Heathrow, giving the go-ahead to shale gas, and plenty of other things that this government is currently doing actually represents the highest possible ambition that the UK could have. Paris also invited the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to provide a special report in 2018 on the impacts of 1.5 degree warming and related greenhouse gas emission pathways. Now, if you think about this, this is really quite a very tight timetable. We all know how long it takes to plan research. We all know how long it takes to secure funding for research, let alone publishing and getting peer-reviewed published papers of research. And so, given that this was agreed in December last year, to say that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in itself is a peer review process of peer-reviewed papers from academia, to come out with an output there and a report that it files back with the UNFCCC by 2018, that's really pushing it to try and get that research done. And what that tells us is the requirement, the need for universities and research institutes globally to really step up to this challenge and to shift their research focus onto the 1.5 degree mitigation pathway is huge. It is the most extraordinarily demanding request, but a very serious request by 190 governments, not one to be ignored or to be picked up slowly and dabbled with slowly. So we thought it might be useful, at Friends of the Earth we thought it might be a useful contribution to the debate to send a letter to the Vice-Chancellors of 40 UK universities, and we sent this back in March, a letter to 40 UK universities and 19 UK research councils to ask very politely what they were doing and how they were responding to this 1.5 degree challenge. And I want to say something now which is really important. I mean, it's a little bit like if you watch Strictly Come Dancing, what I'm about to do is what the judges often do on that, at least 3 of them, which is say some really nice things now, and you know that means that I've got some other stuff coming up later. But the reason we wanted to do this is British universities, British research has been at the forefront, really. Absolutely up there at the forefront of climate science. The contribution that British universities and research institutes have made to a better understanding of the physical science base for climate change cannot be denied, let alone also for adaptation as well. It's a huge contribution that Britain makes to it, and so it's incredibly important if we in this country with our research infrastructure don't step up to the plate here, the whole world will have a real problem. Obviously there's great research happening and based in other countries as well. It's not to take away from that. But British research has long been a critical component of, absolutely at the forefront of understanding climate change and building that understanding. It's something I always find kind of quite ironic when you have people like Nigel Lawson and Matt Ridley and so on raising questions about climate change science. Actually what they're doing is dissing, if you like, the very best of British research, I find. But anyway, so we sent that letter and to 40 universities and 19 research institutes. And I'll give you some headlines overall of the response we got. The first thing to say is we got an astonishing 97% response rate, which is very, very good. I am being a little bit kind there, in as much that we had an original deadline, I think, of the end of April or early May. And in the end, we had a couple of volunteers in the office pretty much phoning Vice-Chancellor's offices every day through May to try and get responses from some of them. And it's a very handy thing, actually, to say that we're about to publish the results of this in the press next week. It's quite a good way to get the response from Vice-Chancellor's offices. I recommend it any time. But we did get a really good response rate. I have to say that the University of Oxford was one of the very best on this. The letter was passed to the Environmental Change Institute. The response came from Professor Jim Hall. And amazingly, we got that at the end of March, which was absolutely extraordinary compared to others. So that was very good. All responses were clear that climate change is a major challenge, which is good. You'd be slightly concerned if they weren't. Most, but not all, responses referred to the goal of 1.5 degrees. I mean, we found it disappointing that they didn't all respond to it, given that our letter was explicitly about that. It's not we didn't write to them all and say, what are you doing about climate change? We said specifically, what are you doing about the new agreement and the 1.5 degrees? So it was disappointing that they didn't all respond to that, because it felt like some were just not answering the question. Some responses talked about research, others looked at wider institutional impacts. And there were some glaring contradictions, sometimes within the same institutions, which perhaps won't surprise many of you, but we'll come on to that in a little while. And we also found lots of examples of many institutional actions that were working directly against the Paris goal. I'm talking generically here about the whole sector. I'm not talking about any particular university here, but we'll come on to some of that. I want to tell you that all of these responses are on our website. So if you Google or use an alternative search engine provider, how can universities respond to climate change on the Friends of the Earth website, you'll see copies of all the letters we received back and the original letter we asked, in case you're interested. And this was a letter back from Oxford, from ECI. I said Professor Jim Hill responded to this. It was a very good letter, I'm very pleased to say. It actually answered the questions we asked, which was very encouraging. Focused very much on research, which actually our letter did as well. So focused on that. And really seemed to understand the urgency of the 1.5 degree change, the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, and highlighted various initiatives which I'll come on to in the rest of the presentation, so I'm grateful to that. It's also the letter that invited me to come and do this talk, although originally hoping for June, but I couldn't do it, I'm afraid. We think the most important area is research. The biggest impact that universities can have on the climate, and I'll come on to operations and other things later on, is the contribution that they can make from research. That if we didn't have that, if universities weren't stepping up to the plate on research around climate impacts, we'd have a real problem. So that's the real focus. And again, I'm only going to give headline answers here. There's so much more detail in those letters that you can look at them all online, as I said. A large minority, so the highlights is that a large minority of institutions have changed their research plans to address the 1.5 degree goal. So it's good that there's quite a lot of them already by spring last year had done that. That is good. But actually by that time most had not, which we found concerning. What was really alarming is that some universities, I've said already, this was not the case for Oxford, but some universities didn't seem to appreciate the significant difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. And I want to say that the September conference that you've now had, the September conference on 1.5, specifically on 1.5 degrees, organised by the University of Oxford, Leeds, Met Office and Tyndall, did stand out as exceptional in the British university sector as really trying to grapple with the central question that we think needs to be looked at here. What needs to change, what research needs to be conducted to try and enable this Paris goal to be reached. Some other highlights. Grantham LSC doing some really interesting, useful research on the adequacy of those national determined contributions, those plans, you know, what more is needed to enable us to reach that. SOAS doing some great work on new models of economic development and what that might become compatible with 1.5 degrees. Exeter has its Helix project, which will address different 1.5 degree scenarios. And Leeds, the new Priestley Centre, has got a whole package of research based on the outcomes of Paris, including the co-benefits of rapid climate mitigation, which look very interesting, but we haven't got into the details of them yet. One of the biggest disappointments was that Research UK, the funding body, and particularly the Global Challenges Research Fund, seemed to give a very low priority to climate research. We think it's extraordinary, really, that a fund called Global Challenges Research Fund seems to place such a low priority on this. And we think there's, more generally, we think there's a lot more effort and priority that needs to be given by the funding councils to this issue. They seem to be waking up quite slowly to the outcomes of Paris, and of course that affects everyone's ability to undertake the research. That's just overview highlights on the research. There was also a lot of interesting responses. We didn't necessarily ask questions on this, but sometimes universities and institutes volunteered very interesting information that go beyond research. And this is categorised into three areas. The first is around university operations. And what was kind of very disappointing is that not all universities even have carbon reduction targets. Of those that do, they vary very widely in ambition. So you have like 48% by 2020 by Royal Holloway. I think that's to appeal to the people that voted for Remain. And carbon neutral by 2025 for Sheffield, or by 2019 for St Andrews. But many universities, as I said, didn't even have carbon reduction targets, which we think is really surprising in this day and age. And if you think about it, Friends of the Earth would be very critical of a FTSE 100 company that didn't have a carbon reduction strategy. So it's quite alarming that some of the biggest British universities don't. Even of those that do, the vast majority are not in line with the Paris goals. All of them really need to be reviewed to ensure that the carbon reduction strategies of individual universities are in line with that. There's some interesting things going on. Newcastle University is investing £14 million in renewable energy generation. And interestingly, only one institute told us, or that we can only find evidence at the moment, that only one organisation, King's College London, has signed the UNFCCC pledge for action that was announced in Paris last year. Another part of the response is the sort of broader impact and strategy that universities can have with their education, of course. And again, it's really interesting to see a huge variety in approaches here. So, for example, Manchester University puts all first-year undergrads through a compulsory exercise in sustainability, a compulsory module in sustainability, including looking at Paris. And Bristol believes that addressing environmental sustainability must be a critical part of their educational offer. Leeds is also establishing a living lab, which sounds very interesting. It's early days yet, but essentially what they're saying is where they're doing very interesting research on issues to do with climate change and so on, they're saying that has to immediately reflect on behavioural change on campus as well, which sounds like a very interesting project to us. And then there's so many more things around outreach, some interesting things going on in some cases. it seems very little going on. So Glasgow University is supporting a future demonstrator city. This is a huge project with massive levels of big ambitions for engagement in the Glasgow city population. Very exciting to see. Manchester just next month is going to launch a 10,000 actions programme, which is for the wider population in Manchester, not just university students or staff. And UCL has been awarded the first class award from People and Planet in their league ranking because of their outreach work. So at the top end, there's some really interesting, innovative initiatives taking place, but in many cases, there seems to be very little attempt by universities to undertake that outreach. But it's also worth saying that a lot of this is based on the responses we got from Vice-Chancellor's offices, and I'll come to this, but one of the biggest problems actually is that it seems that a lot of climate change work in universities is quite siloed, and a big question is to what extent Vice-Chancellor's offices really knew or referenced to some of the work taking place, including on outreach. So, for example, in the University of Cambridge, there's a lot of work going on in the business school and in other institutes there that is around outreach on specifically on climate change, which were not referenced in the Vice-Chancellor's letter, and we think that that will be true in many other cases as well. Finance and investment. This was absolutely fascinating, given that there's been quite a lot of campaigns by students over the last few years to try and encourage universities to divest some of their investment and pensions and so on from fossil fuels. So we were very surprised, really, that hardly any institution mentioned anything concerning the impacts of investments, pension funds, sponsorship or donations on climate change. And actually we think probably that underplays what's really going on, because the evidence is that 24 universities have now made some form of divestment in the last year. I think many of you will be aware this has been a big campaign in the United States, in US universities. It's really started getting going in the last year or so here as well, but has further to go, I would suggest. And so there has been some reaction on this. But it was surprising that we often had letters that talked about the recycling they're doing on campus and all these kind of things, which is all good stuff, but didn't mention this huge area of impact that universities can have with their investments and their pension funds investing in fossil fuel companies. And of course the big one is the university's superannuation scheme. USS, the pension fund for university staff, which has billions and billions invested in the stock market, including in fossil fuel companies. And only the University of Warwick, I think it was, mentioned their own attempts to try and encourage USS to shift some of those investments. So what do I mean by fossilised elephants in the room? We think this is one of the biggest challenges for universities, is that even universities that are doing some of the best work, that have scored best on shifting their research around 1.5 degrees, that might be doing really well in trying to decarbonise their operations, that have really good outreach, then seem to have this huge blind spot about the fact that there will then be a massive research programme in some cases looking at how the world can go exploring for yet more fossil fuels. Quite extraordinary in some cases how there might be tens of millions of pounds of funding coming into universities from fossil fuel companies to fund research into getting more oil and gas and sometimes even coal out the ground. And often this has no link either in the research to carbon capture and storage. So there seems to be a kind of very I would say, at the very least, lazy, possibly naive assumption that carbon capture and storage is going to be deployed very widely. My own view is I think carbon capture and storage has still got a role to play, but it's been so slow to get off the ground. It's quite a funny pun, but anyway, it's so slow to get off the ground, didn't even plan that, I really doubt now that it's going to be a big thing. I think the changes that you see in renewable energy and so on mean that carbon capture and storage every year is looking like it's going to play a smaller and smaller role. And so then you have to ask the question, how do universities balance this? The idea of really trying to fuel extra research in getting more and more oil and gas out the ground. And again, you have to compare, would universities be happy to do that on a range of other issues? We know it's been controversial for quite a long time for universities to take big money, say, from tobacco companies to fund research on growing tobacco plants in more stressed environments, for example, to try and make it easier to grow tobacco. That's been kind of quite difficult, controversial for a long time. Why is it not seen as controversial yet, perhaps for universities to take so much funding to fund that research in getting more oil and gas out the ground, when we know that around 80% of the fossil fuels that have already been discovered are going to have to be left in the ground if we're going to have any hope of reaching 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. So very quickly, I want to sort of start the discussion building on the work that organisations like People and Planet and other initiatives like the Green Gown Awards and so on have already done about what might be a comprehensive climate change strategy for a university. And there's so many things we could say here. These are some of our top 10 at the moment. We think it's really important all universities present a strong, positive vision about how the world can meet the Paris goals. There's too many naysayers out there. There's too many people that say it cannot be done. And the truth is, a lot of the problem is that research hasn't been done into how we can do it. We haven't set it out as a research question until actually pretty recently about how can we stabilise global temperatures at 1.5 degrees. For too long, there's been a whole kind of research paradigm which is about kind of quite a leisurely transition pathway to 2 degrees. And even then, even in some of the best research, it seems to forget the probability issues. You know, what about if we wanted to go for better than 50-50 chance of 1.5 degrees? How would we achieve that? What would 80% chance of 2 degrees look like rather than 50-50 if we're going to go for 50% chance of 1.5 degrees? We need universities and research institutes to really promote that strong vision of how to do that. And clearly that means a really strong and urgent focus on mitigation research on meeting that 1.5 degree goal and making sure that that's assembled and funneled back into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process so that that can go into the UNFCCC process. Again, I want to say Oxford has clearly played a leading role in this, not least with the 1.5 degree conference, but in other initiatives as well, and that's very, very welcome. But we do think it's critically important. If that's not then going to, all that good work is going to be undone, we'd like to encourage all universities to develop what we would call a research transition pathway away from research on how to extract yet more fossil fuels. It's really hard to see how that can be defended in the absence of widespread CCS, and that is looking less likely than ever, to see how we can extract more and more fossil fuels. We think it's important all universities implement a comprehensive education programme for students, staff, residents and businesses. And actually this can be one of the great ways in which universities reach beyond staff and students and into their wider towns and cities in which they're located and really build those relationships, break down any divisions that might exist between town and gown. This is a great way to do it around climate change and the broader sustainability arena. And where you see universities that are really doing ambitious programs in that area, that's just the effect it is having. And number 5, be part of a global network of universities that are committed to the Paris goals. One of these is starting to form, but actually the more that universities can join up with other universities to have strength in mass by being part of a common network to do this, the stronger it will be. Obviously, for all universities to develop a timetable plan to go zero carbon and to be really public about it, compare them with each other, challenge each other, partner by one university budding another and so on to challenge each other to go further. And we think it's entirely appropriate for all universities to divest their funds, their pensions, their investments from fossil fuels by 2020 We think we're almost being generous there, but I mean, it really is. There's so many universities in the US that have now done this. There's so many other organisations that are doing it. There's no reason why universities shouldn't. Another thing to think about is screening companies attending career fairs. You know, is this, we just compare to other things in life, you know. There's been lots of debate for years whether it's right to have tobacco companies in career fairs, for example. We've got to start having that debate now about fossil fuel companies as well. Obviously, universities should develop their own climate adaptation strategies, particularly the oldest universities with lovely old buildings like Oxford. Actually, how is the infrastructure of Oxford University going to stand up to more extreme weather events in the years ahead? And part of that is about all those things about energy efficiency. You know, the more insulation you put into old buildings, yes, you save heat, you save energy, but actually they will suffer less in very hot periods, hot summers as well, the people in them. So there's a lot to be gained there. But that shouldn't just be done in isolation. This again is an opportunity to break down any possible real or perceived gaps between town and gown. This is an opportunity to reach out and to develop local adaptation strategies for the whole of the city or region which you're in and see how those work together. Because in many cases, of course, a university will be one of the biggest employers and one of the biggest institutions in a particular town or city, and they can play a huge role in shaping the lead for the change that a city as a whole might want to deliver in its climate mitigation and adaptation strategy. And then the 10th, but actually a really important point, is to embed the responsibility for the delivery of this in the senior leadership team for the university as a whole. Really, the one concern we had about the response we got from the University of Oxford is that it came from the Environmental Change Institute. You know, that was great. It didn't surprise us that a letter from ECI was going to be very good on this issue. But what happened is clearly the Vice-Chancellor's office saw the words climate change, passed it to ECI, thought it's their job to do. That's the impression we got from it, rather than thinking this was a whole job for the university, and actually was the responsibility of the Vice-Chancellor's office to respond and to get input from across the university as well. You know, we will not solve this issue if we create climate silos within our institutions. This has to, in the same way that health and safety, you wouldn't get a letter on health and safety to the Vice-Chancellor's office and it be given to the medical school, nor should a letter like this on climate change just be given to ECI, much as we very much like the letter we got back from you guys. So I'll repeat again, all these letters, if you can read, if you really want to go into the dirty details, all the letters from all these institutes and universities are on our website. We did tell them in advance that's what we would do, by the way. So it's not like we suddenly surprised them in that. Also, this suggestion about what a proper climate change strategy for any university would look like. And the most important bit on this webpage is this bit here. Please give us your feedback. We want to hear what you think and get your thoughts about what actually would a good university climate change strategy look like. And we as Friends of the Earth feel it's really important to push British universities and research institutes to do even better on this. And we do that in a very critical, friendly kind of way, because we actually think the reality is British universities have played a hugely important leadership role in research on climate change. We now need to see British universities and research institutes go even further on that on research, but do it across all the ways in which universities impact positively and negatively on our society, because this is such a huge issue. And when you look at so many of those mission statements for British universities, which are about improving the state of the world or making a contribution to a better society and so on, how can those mission statements be realised if it's not really properly, thoroughly, comprehensively addressing climate change? Thank you very much.